Okay, great. I guess we are already online. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our new session of Eurasia Talks seminars organized by Karabiuk University and Middle East Technical University, and with the support of Dünya Ortası podcast channel. So now I will give a floor to our co-host Işık Kuchu Bonanfart. So please, Işık Hoca, the floor is yours. Can you just introduce our today's speaker and tell us about him a little bit?
Okay, this is exciting as Professor Fierman was my advisor for my PhD dissertation, so I'm kind of like particularly nervous. I don't want to make this too personal, but at the same time, I mean, when Professor Fierman is the guest, things are personal to me because he was my advisor. His class enabled me and my husband match. And then, we were in the field in Kazakhstan at some point. He helped me a lot in the whole process. And I kind of learned from him how to be, he's my role model, basically, how to be a great professor and yet modest, despite he is like a very prominent expert in Central Asia. But he was still able to respond to my needs whenever I needed. So that's why I think having him as a role model, I hope is helping my students as well. They're here, some of them, so let's ask them. Well, Professor Fierman, I think 1979, right, graduated from Harvard University Political Science Department. And then had a long career on Central Asia, learning all the languages available in the post-Soviet region, actually not limited to Central Asia, I guess Russian and maybe some Chinese too, like I can't remember. Yeah, I'm just not going to get in there because, and I think this is very important, the topic of today's Eurasia Talks series is Kazakhstan is a country that I also focus on my PhD dissertation, and I still work on, and that's a country that I like, the People's Society, and I think the country has come a long way since 1991, and the language politics is a critical issue, obviously, for the country and for its nation building efforts. And I think Professor Fierman is a great expert on discussing these issues in comparison with other Central Asian countries, which are also going through some rough processes of transition, some of them still. So I'll let Professor Fierman, I'll let him talk, I guess. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Işık. And thank you, Yulia, for the invitation and for all the arrangements to make this possible. In terms of transition, I think I could say the same about the United States right now, but that is not what you had in mind, I suppose. Let me explain at the beginning that although I'll be focusing on Kazakhstan in my presentation, I'll refer a little bit to other parts of the former Soviet Union, in particular Central Asia. My idea is that we can come back to talk about the other countries in the question, answers, and discussion. I'm going to use some slippery concepts, which I'm also not going to try to define now. We can come back to them if you want in the discussion, but I have a lot of other things I want to say. So I'm not going to try to define what is a language, because that is actually a very complicated issue. We can talk about English, for example, but we could also talk about Englishes. I'm also not going to talk about what it means to know a language, even though I will be talking about how many people know a language in some of the, in Kazakhstan and in some other countries. And I'm not going to try to define what is language policy. So I'm slipping away on those, but we can come back to them in the discussion. I do want to put out on the table a few concepts that some people might not be familiar with. I'll be talking about language status, which means not just such things as whether a language is defined in the Constitution or in laws, but also has to do with the status of its use in various domains or fields, such as education or in public services. Another term that I'm going to be talking about somewhat is language acquisition. Some sociolinguists put this as a part of status, but it refers specifically to teaching, acquiring languages. And that is, of course, a very important question with regard to sociolinguistics or political linguistics. And then another term, the third one I'll be using at times, is language corpus. And language corpus has to do with the corpus or the body of the language, such things as, for example, the terminology, the script, the alphabet, the orthography. Now, all three of these, of course, are very closely interrelated. For example, if we're talking about status of language, if it's used in a certain field, that has something to do with how the corpus is developed, whether there's terminology in a certain field. So these are all three very closely related, but I'm going to be talking about all three of them, and I wanted to make sure those were clear. Also wanted to mention that language, as you are aware of, although maybe not thinking right at the moment, is important in two ways, or we can divide the ways into two. One, that language is an instrument that we use to communicate things. And yet language has an extraordinarily important symbolic value. You might want to keep those in mind as we go forward. Now, studying these issues of language status, acquisition, and corpus in a particular society the difficulty varies from society to society over time. They also vary. In the Soviet era, for example, we could learn certain things quite easily about the formal status, but it was very difficult to find out much about informal status, what was actually happening somewhere in the former Soviet Union. And even within a certain country today, a particular society, take Turkmenistan, if we take something like status, it's relatively easy to find what the formal status of language, the Turkmen language, is in the laws. But to know what the status is somewhere out in a particular oblast or wilayat is difficult. We can't be comprehensive, but I think it's important to recognize that some things are much easier to study than others. One dimension, language policy making, is of course extremely important. And in some societies, that's extraordinarily difficult. We don't know much about language policy making in a society like Turkmenistan. Kazakhstan is somewhat easier. I want to contextualize language in Kazakhstan by providing a simple categorization of languages within the Soviet Union. One is it's a three-part categorization. One is Russian. Russian was promoted as not only the language of Russian speakers, but the second mother tongue of all non-Russians in the Soviet Union. So Russian had an oversized, giant role in the Soviet Union. Beyond Russian, however, there were some languages which represented the ethnic groups which had their own union republics. The Soviet Union was a federal system, at least on paper, and there were some that were union republics, 15 union republics. And these are for the most part, the units that have become independent countries after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The republic languages were relatively developed compared to those of a third category, languages of units which did not have a union republic, of ethnic groups that did not have their own union republic. Here we could talk about the Tatars, the Komi, the Chukchi, the Karakalpaks, and these languages were not developed nearly as much as the other languages. They were not, their status was much lower. They were used much less in certain types of environments than the Union Republic languages, let alone Russian, which was everywhere practically. The Union Republic languages, of course, included those of what are today the Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Some of the languages, even of the Union republics, had in fact I would say a higher status than the others, and the language situation in the different republics of the Soviet Union were different. Everywhere, of course, Russian was promoted in terms of acquisition. The corpus language, the corpus of languages was quite developed for, not to mention Russian, but of course also the Union Republic languages. But I would argue that probably in areas like the Caucasus and in the Baltic, these Union Republic languages were probably developed more in their corpus, in part because they were used in many fields which even the Union Republic languages of Central Asia were not. So that in let's say Georgia or in Estonia, these languages were used much more, let's say, in higher education than any of the Central Asian languages, even during the Soviet era. In the post-Soviet era, which is the focus of my talk today, in Central Asia and every other country of Central Asia, a major theme is the de-Russification of the languages, or the de-Sovietization of the languages, and the nationalization of the languages. That is bringing the language status and more emphasis on the titular language, and raising the status of the titular language vis-a-vis Russian. This is almost universally true throughout the former Soviet Union. I'm going to be talking about 6 factors relating to language policies and developments, which I think are important. I don't mean to imply that these are the only ones, and indeed they are interdependent and overlap to some extent. But the ones I'm going to be talking about in more detail in just a moment, I think these all have an important impact on the language situation in each of the countries, and of course in Kazakhstan. One, is the political leadership's nation building project. What I mean by this is whether the emphasis in creating the nation is heavily on the singular titular language and nation, or whether it is a broader one. I'll be talking more about this in a moment, so if it's not quite clear, I'll clear it up in a moment, I hope. A second important factor, I think, is the language repertoires of the population when the Soviet Union fell apart. What languages did the people know? Now, here's again, you could say, well, what does it mean to know, and what is a language? But as I said, I'm not going to be discussing that until the discussion, if you want. A third important factor is the demography of the country that became independent, the demography in 1991, and the change since then. The fourth factor is the degree and nature of the international alignment with Russia. All of the countries, to some extent, have relations, of course, with Russia, some of them more closely aligned. I think that this has an influence on language policy. A fifth factor is what I call the texture of the authoritarian political system. All of these systems, I would argue, are authoritarian. Some of them are more authoritarian or have less opportunity for input from elites, other elites besides the single leader, and population at large. And finally, the financial resources are important with regard to language change. So let me go back over these quickly with reference to Kazakhstan and how it fits into Central Asia more broadly, what's unique or similar about Kazakhstan. And then I'll come back and talk in greater detail about each of them in Kazakhstan. But for now, in terms of the nation building project, Kazakhstan has Kazakhstan leadership, that is former President Nazarbayev, has attempted to build an identity of Kazakhstani which includes other nationalities, other ethnic groups. Inside Central Asia, the closest, I would say, is Kyrgyzstan, although in recent years, Kyrgyzstan has become, the focus has been more on the ethnic Kyrgyz, less on the other nationalities. In terms of language repertoires, as of 1991, the level of Russian competency or knowledge was far greater than anywhere else in Central Asia. And at the same time, not surprising, among the non-titular groups, very low level of competency of the titular language, especially by the Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles. But this is true throughout the region. In terms of demography, as of 1991 and subsequent changes, as all of Central Asia, Kazakhstan has experienced great change, increase in the share of the titular nationality, and a decline of the Slavs and certain other nationalities. Just the same, Kazakhstan remains by far the most Russian in terms of demographic composition inside Central Asia, far more than anywhere else, and that is important, including for language. The fourth factor, which I want to just briefly touch on with regard to the region more broadly, the international alignment with Russia. Kazakhstan is very closely aligned with Russia, not to mention that it has a 4,000-mile border with Russia. Also, in this way, similar to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in a rather different way. But I would contrast this with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which have been less politically, economically aligned with Russia. In terms of the texture of the authoritarian political system, I would argue that Kazakhstan's authoritarianism has been softer than that in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Obviously, in a system where you have a harsher political system, the government can implement certain policies with greater effectiveness than in one with a softer political system. And finally, the financial resources. Kazakhstan is by far the wealthiest of the Central Asian countries. At one point, perhaps Turkmenistan was not too far behind, but despite the decline in the oil price and revenue, Kazakhstan is unique. And this is important because money allows the development of the corpus of the language to a much greater extent, allows greater investment in teaching the language, so in acquisition. So it's very important. And it's also, wealth is important with regard to whether the population has to travel to Russia to find work. Okay.
Professor, can I
yes.
just say something for our participants? If you have questions to the Professor Fierman, please write these questions to the chat first, and then after the presentation finished, we can make a queue of the questions, so you will be able to ask them. So I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, thank you. No hard questions, please. So let's look at Kazakhstan in a little bit greater detail with regard to those 6 factors. We can talk about the Kazakhstan nation building project as being broad, inclusive, or creating a civic identity, as opposed to narrow, exclusive, or attempting to build a nation state. In terms of the breadth, the Kazakhstan leadership frequently refers to the fact that Kazakhstan is multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multilingual. It has over 100 ethnic groups. There is an organization or a structure called the Assembly of the People, which used to be the Assembly of the Peoples, plural. So in that sense, it looks like a very diverse country. But in fact, Kazakhstan, for the most part, has 2 important, in terms of numbers, ethnic groups, and 2 languages. And one is Kazakh and the other is Russian. So Russian is by far the most important non-Kazakh language in Kazakhstan, and Russians are by far the most numerous group. The broad policy of nation building is also reflected in the language policy. So there is an attempt to accommodate Russian to a great extent, and at least on paper, and to some extent, in fact, the other languages. At the same time, I would argue that this broad, wide nation-building project is in tension with one to promote Kazakh and Kazakhs as the most important. And the government has been successful in doing this, I think, thanks to finessing of the question and ambiguity. Let me give you a couple examples of that. In 1989, when the first law on language was adopted, this of course was still before the Soviet Union fell apart, the language law in Russian was Zakon o языках, plural, language law on languages. The Kazakh version of the same law was Til туралы заң, the law on language, singular. And this is не случайно, как говорят по-русски. This is not by chance. We can come back to this. Another example of the ambiguity, the 1995 Constitution, still in effect today, and the language law of 1997, still in effect today, which codify the language law, codify the role of language, has a very interesting reference to Russian. That there was debate about the 1995 Constitution whether to make Russian the second state language. This was rejected. The fallback position of those who wanted Russian as the second state language was to make it the official language, официальный or resmi language. That was also rejected. And so the Constitution and also the language law has a very funny, I would say, that's funny in terms of strange, formulation, which gives Russian it's not official, but is the officially used, официально употребляемый язык in certain certain situations. So this is an example of the finessing or the ambiguity and the arguments about it. Even today, there is a petition being circulated in Kazakhstan to remove this from the Constitution. We can talk in the question and answer what this has meant. Nazarbayev himself, even though the Constitution and language law talks about, make it clear that Russian is not the официальный язык, Nazarbayev also refers to Russian as the официальный язык at times. So it's ambiguity, and Kazakhstan has managed to have a relatively peaceful development on the language issue, I would argue, because of that. In terms of language repertoires in 1991, the second factor that I mentioned early above, we have the best we can do in terms of judging that is the 1989 census figures. The 1989 census figures and Soviet census figures more generally on language are not very reliable, but that's all we've got. The respondents in the census were asked about their native language, whether they were fluent in Russian and any other language. There was a problem here, or it's a problem for us trying to study it, is that in the Soviet Union, most people assumed that their native language was the language of their ethnic group or nationality, whether they knew it or not. So the Kazakhs overwhelmingly, even many who didn't know much Kazakh at all, answered Kazakh was their native language. And this, of course, makes measuring the language repertoires of the population at the time difficult. Nevertheless, compared to the rest of Central Asia, Kazakhs, I would argue, by and large, taking the whole population, had a weaker level of knowledge of the Kazakh language, and a better level, greater percentage of the population had a high level of knowledge of Russian. According to the statistics of the census, 83% of the total population of Kazakhstan claimed that Russian was either the native language or that they were fluent in it. And even 64% of ethnic Kazakhs claim that they were fluent in Russian. Now, this is much greater than anywhere else for any other titular group in Central Asia. The nearest one, it was Kyrgyzstan, somewhere in the 40s. And then below that, Tajikistan at 30% for the titular nationality in Tajikistan, and around that for Turkmenistan. Uzbekistan figures for native knowledge of Russian are particularly suspect. I can go into that in the question and answers if you want. I explained why it's so difficult to measure the Kazakh. The number of people who knew Kazakh, were fluent in Kazakh at the breakup of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, it's important to note that 2/3 of ethnic Kazakh children, even in the late Soviet era, were studying in Kazakh medium classes or schools. These were mostly in rural areas. There were few schools in urban areas. My estimate is that somewhere around 30% of the total population of Kazakhstan was fluent in Kazakh at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Compare that to, at least according to the census, 80+% who were fluent in Russian. If we look at the demographic picture of Kazakhstan, according to the 1989 census, the number of Kazakhs and Russians were relatively equal, both slightly under 40%. Kazakhs were 39.7%, Russians were 37.8%. There were 6% other Slavs, mainly Ukrainians and Belarusians. I'll mention in parentheses here that many of them, if not most, were actually dominant Russian speakers, even though they claimed their native language, many of them as Ukrainian or Belarusian. And then beyond that, there were 15–16% of other ethnic groups, most notably the Germans, around 5% plus, most of whom have since left Kazakhstan. The picture in the country was, as a whole, was very different than in urban areas. The share of Slavs compared to the share of Kazakhs in urban areas, 1989 census, was 60% for the Slavs, only 26.7% for the Kazakhs. So more than twice the number of Slavs as Kazakhs in urban areas in 1989. Almaty, then the capital and the largest city, was only 22.5% Kazakh at the time. Incidentally, if you go way back to 1959, the ethnic Kazakh share of Almaty or Almata was around 8%. So this was already more Kazakh by then. The demographic composition of the country I'm talking about the country as a whole, but it's important to keep in contact that one, there is no single Kazakhstan. The picture, the demographic and linguistic picture is very different depending on the region of the country that you're looking at and over time. And I have some slides, Yulia, if you'd be so kind, to go to those slides. And
with the map, right?
Yes, okay. The map.
We are already there.
Okay, and take a look at the first one. I'm going to ask you to go through them slowly and then go back to the first one. This shows each oblast the share of Kazakhs. Most of the rest in most of the oblasts were Russians or other Slavs, some German in some oblasts. But if you could go through those slides slowly and then watch the change in colors, you can see how the picture in terms of demography has changed over time. So you see the great difference regionally and over time in terms of demography. And although, of course, many Kazakhs are Russian dominant and don't know much Kazakh, but nevertheless, there's a much greater likelihood of Kazakhs knowing Kazakh than non-Kazakhs. Okay, if we could go on to the next slide, if you've had it, has that been long enough to look at those to get a
just
general...
after the maps, right? International.
Right.
Okay.
As you noted on the maps, by the way, the Slavs were concentrated. The Kazakhs were weakest in the north and the east, and therefore the Slavs are there, are concentrated there. That's the explanation, depending on which side of the picture you want to look at. In any case, if we look at today's ethnic breakdown, the figures are not consistent, but what I've been able to gather from various sources, and you'll find contradictory statistics, is that Kazakhs are around 70% of the total population. Russians are around 20, probably a little bit under. Keep in mind, since we're talking about language primarily in the overall presentation, that even many of the Kazakhs are Russian dominant speakers. Beyond the Kazakhs and Russians, there are 10+% of non-Russian, non-Kazakhs. It's quite striking if we look at this in terms of the fact that whereas in 1989, the proportion of Kazakhs was about the same as Russians, so 1-to-1, today in Kazakhstan, there are more than 3 Kazakhs for every Russian in the population of the country. So that's a dramatic change. All right, let's go on to the next topic, the quality of international alignment with Russia. This is, of course, relevant to language policy because Russia has exerted more influence on the countries that have been closer aligned with it, including Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's leadership has claimed to have a multi-vector international alignment. That's generally true, good relations with the European Union, the United States, China, Turkey, and other countries. But the dominant player in Kazakhstan, the dominant alliance, is with Russia, and particularly compared to countries like Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So these are important factors. There are some important irritants in the relations between Kazakhstan and Russia. Just to name a few, one, Russia is unhappy with Kazakhstan that it has not recognized the incorporation of Crimea into Russia, and that has caused some problems. The very recent arguments about whether Russia gave territories to other parts of the former Soviet Union as gifts. The Kazakh, many Kazakh intellectuals and leaders have argued with this, and this is a statement made really at the top by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, that Russia gave as gifts territories to the other republics, including, of course, Kazakhstan. And there is a feeling among many Kazakhs, and not just Kazakhs, population in Kazakhstan, that the Eurasian Economic Union is not really a good deal economically. It's not to Kazakhstan's benefit. So there are tensions over this as well. So Russia, to sum up this factor, Kazakhstan, yes, very closely aligned with Russia, not to say that the relation is not with its problems. In terms of the texture of the authoritarian system, again, all Central Asian countries have authoritarian systems, I would argue. And Kazakhstan is one of the softer, less authoritarian systems. Perhaps the transition from Nazarbayev to successors will open up some space for reforms that will make it less or more authoritarian, I suppose. But for our purposes here, I wanted to point out that there have been broad debates about language policy in the press, of course, on the internet chat rooms and so forth, on questions like alphabet, terminology. The press is filled, especially the Kazakh press, filled with discussions about things like orthography and terminology, and the policy of trilingualism, which I'll come to a little bit later near the end. There were a lot of very differing views expressed on it, and this kind of discussion, thanks to the less authoritarian system in Kazakhstan, is very different from what you could have observed in an analogous project in, let's say, Uzbekistan or in Turkmenistan. Finally, with regard to wealth, I mentioned earlier why I think the wealth or economic capacity of the country is important. Kazakhstan, despite the decline in oil price, is relatively wealthy. That's, of course, not to say that everyone in Kazakhstan is rich or that there are no poor people, but just a snapshot indicator of that, I found the purchasing power per capita provided by World Bank. Kazakhstan, the per capita purchasing, that's quite a mouthful, per capita purchasing power, it was in 2018 or 19, about $28,000 equivalent. Turkmenistan, $15,000. The other three countries were somewhere in the range of $4,000 to $7,000 per capita. So Kazakhstan, according to that, has been wealthier and remains wealthier compared to the others. All right. So what has been happening with regard to language, and what is happening? I guess that's why most of you wanted to attend this, if you're still with me. So finally, here we are. Many of the changes in language and language policy have been rather symbolic. Yuli, what time is it right about now? So I have an idea.
It's already like 45 minutes.
Okay,
So like
I
40
will.
minutes past.
Okay, 40. Okay, I think I'll be okay. Many of the changes have been symbolic. Among the most obvious, visible, or are the symbolic changes. And here, the toponym or the place name changes. Among these, we have cities. These names have changed by decision of the central government. They're not ones made by and large by the local people. Let me give you some examples of these changes. Some, the names have changed to new or new old names, such as the cities today, Aktau and Atrau, which were Guryev and Shevchenko in most of the late Soviet period. So here we have some which were changed to something totally different. There have been many cities which the Russian version of the names of the cities has changed, such as Alma-Ata, which according to Kazakhstan's Russian language standard today is Almaty. However, if you go to any sites from Russia, the name of the city in Russian is Alma-Ata. Take your pick. Likewise, the name of Ust-Kamenogorsk, which was the Russian name of Ust-Kamen. Today, the Kazakhstan official Russian name of Ust-Kamen is Ost-Kamen, and Aktyubinsk today is Aktobe in Kazakhstani, if you will, Kazakhstani Russian. There's big debates about what will be done with Pavlodar, Petropavlovsk. We can talk about those in question and answer. And of course, Nur-Sultan, the capital city, which was Astana, and before that had other names. We can go on to the others, like street names. The rules are somewhat more relaxed, but there were, for example, there have been moratoria on renaming of streets and other objects. It varies by region of the country. Some regions faster to move with street change names, naming them. But every city of Kazakhstan today has some major street which fairly recently was named Nur-Sultan or Nur-Sultan Nazarbayev. This is everywhere. I was particularly disappointed when they named the one in Almaty Nur-Sultan Nazarbayev, because it was Furmanov. And I used to tell people that this was in my honor, Fierman. So now I no longer have a street named after me in Almaty. No Furmanov, no Fiermanov left. Other symbolic changes. The money today only has Kazakh on it, no Russian. I might mention here, there at one point when there were still both languages, there were some banknotes which were printed with a mistake in the Kazakh. It was I believe a K instead of a K, that is without it. They put a tail on it by mistake. There are another symbolic kind of things. Frequently presentations will start today in Kazakh. Hello, Kharlikun, and I'm happy to be here. And then they'll end in Kazakh, but all the substance is in Russian. So I mentioned that as a symbolic change. Signage in public places, a lot of this has been changed at least to add Kazakh, and in some places to have only Kazakh or even Kazakh and English. Unfortunately, a lot of the signage in Kazakh is in very poor Kazakh, but that's another issue. Finally, this is symbolic, but it's a very important symbolic issue, Latinization. And I'm going to want to talk about this in somewhat more detail. There continues to be very vigorous debate about Latinization. There are questions about which letters to use in this. And Yulia, if you could go into the next 3 slides and show the 3 versions of the alphabet. There are many others that have been proposed, but these have been sort of officially adopted, but now it seems somewhat on hold. Some with digraphs, that is 2 letters for some of the letters in the Latin alphabet for certain sounds that were, well, we'll just leave it at that. Some with apostrophes and some with diacritical marks. So there are 3 different projects. The debate continues. Strangely, from my perspective, there are many public signs in Kazakhstan offices, including government offices, in Latin. There are coins, if I'm not mistaken, with Kazakhstan Latin on it, when they haven't even really decided for sure which letters, let alone the orthography, is going to be used. And orthography is another issue which there have been many articles about in the Kazakh language press. There are many people who believe that the Kazakh new alphabet, the Latin alphabet, assuming it shifts, must represent every sound with a unique letter, and that this is especially important because this will help preserve the essence, the Turkic nature of the Kazakh language, particularly with regard to vowel harmony, syngarmonism. In Russian, I forgot the Kazakh name for it, undistrik or something. But endless debates about this. And this is symbolically very important for many people because it's their representing of what the Kazakh language is. Many people talk about this as this is a sacred heritage from our ancestors, which we must preserve in the best way we can. There has even been a proposal, I find this bizarre, I don't think it's very widely supported, to Latinize the Russian language used in Kazakhstan. That is the argument of, okay, when we go forward, Russia, of course, only allows 1 alphabet. Even for Tatar, they insist that it be written in Cyrillic. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And therefore, we in Kazakhstan should be able to have Russian in our country written with the Latin letters. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's an interesting proposal. Beyond these symbols, and not to say that the other changes are not important symbolically, there is the whole idea of the whole area of developing new terminology and for many new concepts, because Kazakh is being used in some domains which it was not used in before. How do you develop the terminology? What sources do you take the terminology from? Do you just take the Russian version? Do you take an international, if you would, meaning mainly European version of maybe English roots, Latin roots, or do you go back into some Turkic roots, borrow from another Turkic language? Lots of representation issues here that are very broadly debated. And at the heart of this is, I think, a disagreement on the need, on the degree of de-Russification that should proceed. There have been many dictionaries, specialized dictionaries printed. Kazakhstan has invested in the development of terminology in a way that no other Central Asian country has. My sense is, however, that these are not adhered to, the words that have been developed. So there's a big problem of coordination of the terminology. In terms of shifting domains of the language, initially in 1989, 1991, there was a belief that Kazakhstan should be able to do the same things that were being done in the Baltic, in the Caucasus, that is promoting their titular language, replacing Russian with it. There was one government document which proposed that by 1995, all of the government office work would be shifted from Russian, which it was overwhelmingly, certainly at the center in all of Kazakhstan, from Russian to Kazakh. This was wildly unrealistic. It was also this kind of shift of domain was something that was feared by those who did not know Kazakh, because they would be disadvantaged. Anyway, so the language of office procedures was supposed to change by everywhere in Kazakhstan, even where Kazakhs were 20% of the population and where most of them didn't know much Kazakh. This was just totally unrealistic. The language of the Majlis, the lower level of Kazakhstan's parliament, has shifted to a mix of Kazakh and Russian. Former President Nazarbayev has called for using Kazakhstan in government. Very strangely, just a couple of days after one of his speeches in which he mentioned this, Dariga Nazarbayeva, who was his daughter and was the speaker of the Kazakh Senate, gave an interview in which someone asked her, well, why aren't you using Kazakh in the parliament? And she says, well, no one's prohibited the use of Russian. This is Kazakhstan, where Kazakh is the official language. So again, this, I guess, is a symbol of the contradictory, ambiguous policy in Kazakhstan. Just the same, I would point out that much of government office work has shifted to Kazakh. The law, the way it's written, is in itself ambiguous. Kazakh language version is obligatory in most situations for government documentation. But what has happened in many, many cases is that the serious business of writing the protocols or the of meetings is done in Russian, and then a Kazakh translation is done, which nobody pays attention to. That's changing, has changed greatly already, but the Kazakh Language Committee has issued many reports on the level of shift of or they don't say from, the level of shift to Kazakh language, and they're all over the place. So I won't try to quantify them here, but I would point out that until now, only 2 of all the laws adopted in Kazakhstan have been written in Kazakh originally. That is, they were all translated from Russian. And since law is something which you really have to be quite careful with the details, it's important which language is the authoritative one. And in most cases, it's the Russian version. And many people are aware of this. So they get, the Kazakh version and a Russian version. It depends. I don't mean to say this is universal, but they very often will recognize that the Russian one is really the one to pay attention to, and the Kazakh one is their Gligalachki for, because it has to be in Kazakh. Let's briefly look at education. In terms of primary and medium, secondary, that is education. Let me emphasize again that even in this late Soviet era, around 2/3 of Kazakhs were studying in the Kazakh language, but it was only about 30% of the total secondary, medium school, primary, secondary education enrollment. So it is supposed to be, at least reports were that by in 2015, 65% of primary, secondary school pupils were studying in Kazakh language. There is a claim I saw that in 2015, 87% of ethnic Kazakh primary, secondary school students, pupils, if you will, were studying in the Kazakh language. This, of course, means a much decreased share in Russian medium education. I'll just mention in passing that there are some very small percentages studying in Uzbek, Uyghur, Tajik, and even English in Kazakhstan primary, secondary. With regard to higher education, in the Soviet era, there were also some Kazakh language groups in higher education. But even in the Kazakh language groups, a lot of their education was in Russian, especially after the first year of their education. Even at that, in 1989, it was the figure of higher educational students in Kazakh groups was under 20%. Today, the claim is that 65% of higher education students are in Kazakh groups. I want to qualify that briefly. Even for those in Kazakh language groups, the instructors in many subjects will assign some supplementary materials, or perhaps even mandatory materials, or these students will have to use materials for their research in Russian. So it means in reality that many in Kazakh higher education groups still need to know Russian and English increasingly. For those who are in Russian language groups during their education, at least, there is not much need to know Kazakh. Mass media, entertainment, and I don't think I have this on the slide, but also public services. There's much, much more available today in Kazakh than there was before. There's TV programming. available, and from what I've heard from Kazakh friends, some of the quality is quite good. That said, a lot of people in Kazakhstan are still watching TV from Russia, or watching the Russian language Kazakhstani broadcast. A lot of the stuff from Russia is technologically perhaps better quality. So there's still a very important role for the mass media of the Russian Federation. And public services, President Nazarbayev has intervened on some cases when cases have arisen where Kazakhs refuse to give service to Russian speakers, and that could be a Kazakh Russian speaker, in Russian. And Kazakh and former President Nazarbayev has said that the services must be offered in Russian. What happens in reality? People are people, and you can imagine there's some room for argument about this. In any case, in many public settings, Russian remains the default language. And if you go back to the statistics of what share of the population today knows what language, that it becomes clear why. So let's look at what statistics we have, which again are not very good, for now acquisition and knowledge of languages. The 2009 census data, which are not comparable to the earlier data, but that's what we have. The 2009 census data showed that among the total population of Kazakhstan, 95% claimed that they were able to understand oral Russian. 93% of the entire population, I'm sorry, 92% of Kazakhs claimed that they could understand oral Russian. And of course, 99+% of Russians said they could understand oral Russian. Able to read and write Russian, according to the 2009 census, among the total population, 85% said they could. Among Kazakhs, 79%. Russian continues to be taught as a mandatory subject. In practice, Russian, because it is the default language in many situations, even today, Russian is very common, and so it continues to be used, and a lot of it still remains a very important subject in the curriculum. Also, Russian literature, and again, I'd emphasize the role of the Russian Federation mass media and the internet, which is much more in Russian than in Kazakh, although perhaps shifting. Now, in terms of the Kazakh language, among the total population, 74% in the 2009 census said that they could understand oral Russian. Among Kazakhs, 98% said they could, and among Russians, 22%. I would like to put a big red mark by the Kazakh said 98% they could understand oral Russian, oral Kazakh. I think that that 98% I think would be very simplest Kazakh. There are still many Kazakhs who have very little skill, level of competence in Kazakh language. Able to read and write Kazakh among the total population, according to the 2009 census, 62%. Among Kazakhs, 93%. I would also question that. Take that with a big grain of salt. And Russians, only 6% claim to be able to read and write Russian. And so if you put that all together, the default language in many situations, if most Russians still cannot read and write Kazakh, that means that the language that is held in common by the majority is still Russian. Kazakh language does remain a mandatory subject in the school. That said, the level of Kazakh skills of secondary school leavers, that is graduates, secondary schools from the Russian medium schools or groups, is notoriously poor. Kazakh is a subject which an exam must be taken for the YENT, the national entrance exam for higher education, but it's really not counted. I can go into the details of why it's not counted or how it's not counted later, but on paper it's there, but it's really not very important. The methodology, the pedagogy of teaching Kazakh is still quite poor. The teachers in Kazakhstan, whatever the subject, are not generally paid much. And so this is not whether you're teaching Kazakh or Russian or anything else, for many is not a really lucrative, well, lucrative would be overstating. It's not a good way to make a living to support your family. And there's not much of a penalty for not knowing Kazakh. In many environments in Kazakhstan, many ethnic Kazakhs, I think, feel that it's important for them. And Kazakhs will, the Kazakh dominant will say to Kazakhs who don't know very good Kazakh, they'll say, Uyat, this is a shame, stidno, you should be ashamed of yourself for not knowing your native language. Well, again, that comes back to the definition of native language. Just because someone is an ethnic Kazakh does not mean that his dominant language is Kazakh. So I would argue about the word use of the word native. There was a plan for mastery of the language promulgated in 2010 for the entire population. By 2020, the share of population understanding Kazakh, no definition of what that really meant, was supposed to grow from 60 to 90%. The level of knowing Russian, the share knowing Russian was supposed to go from 89 to 90%, at least 90%. And English, the level of English knowledge was supposed to reach approximately 20%. With regard to English and more generally, and here I'm going to be finishing up, there was a Minister of Education, Yerlan Sagadiev, who promoted a policy called the Trilingualism Policy or Trilingual Policy, starting in 2016. Sagadiev was the Minister of Education. And this, according to this plan, all Kazakhstan schools were to use 3 languages. And starting even with English from the 1st grade, and Russian was to be used even in the Kazakh medium schools for teaching, of course, Russian language, Russian literature, and I think world history or international relations. So even in the Kazakh schools, in the Russian schools, Russian medium schools, and the other small minority, that is Uzbek, Tajik, Uyghur, the subjects of Kazakh language, literature, Kazakhstan history, and maybe geography were supposed to be taught to these pupils studying in Russian medium in the Kazakh language. And in the last 2 or 3 years of secondary school, chemistry, computer science, physics, and biology were supposed to be taught in English entirely. This policy raised great anxiety among many people. It was supposed to be implemented within 3 years. So it meant, for example, taking a biology teacher in the 10th, 11th, 12th grade who didn't know any English, who in 3 years was supposed to be teaching biology in English. This policy was removed for the most part when Sagadeev was removed himself. This was, of course, not Sagadeev's initiative on his own. President Nazarbayev certainly gave his blessing to it, but it was impossible and had many problems, among others, teaching Kazakh geography, given the level of Kazakh knowledge to Russian medium pupils, would have meant nothing. Just going through the motions of teaching. Yes, Russian and Kazakh are still mandatory subjects in the schools in the other language. English, instead of being taught from the first grade, I believe now nationally is supposed to be from the 4th or 5th grade. However, local schools can choose to teach it from the first grade, first level. So that is it. Yulia, if you'd show my last slides, we can talk about the how these do or don't apply in the rest of Central Asia in the remaining time. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you for your attention. I apologize this went on for so long.
Great, Professor Fierman, thank you very much for your really enlightening presentation. And I will stop right now the slides so everyone can see you're in full screen. Let's say, okay.
I want to see you. How do I get to that?
Yeah, Ishik Hoja, please.
No, I mean,
okay, there I got. Okay, I see.
Yep. I think that would work, but
Okay. So I checked the questions that already was sent to the chat, and
only easy ones, please.
There are, of course, there is no easy one on language policy. Come on, I don't think that easy one is possible on this issue. But there are 2 questions actually by somehow connected. So I guess we can ask them together, because probably answering one will be the answering another. And I guess Mr. or Mrs. Kazakh, I don't know if he or she is here. If he or she is here, can ask the question by himself. If not, I will read the question from the chat. Anyone?
Hello. I guess it was my question about Russian language in the status of Russian language in Kyrgyzstan.
Okay, yes. It will be the second one, but okay, let's start with you. If you already connected, let's start with you.
Please.
The language about the Kyrgyzstan, the situation. I don't know the name. It's just like Galaxy 1A.
Sorry, I suppose that my name was written there. My name is Lezat Tungatarova. Actually, I met Professor Fierman in the United States. I'm not aware, did he remember me? But anyway, my question was about the status of Russian language in Kyrgyzstan. As much as I know, it got the status of the second state language. So probably that was the only one Central Asian Republic where the Russian language got this status. So could you please comment why exactly in Kyrgyzstan they supposed to get that status for the Russian language?
Okay, very good question. The status of Russian, official status of Russian
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Kyrgyzstan has actually changed over time. It was never the second state language, I believe. It is, it has been, things right now are fluid again, the official language. You might say, what's the difference between state and official? And indeed, that many in Kazakhstan say, well, there is no difference. And this was the argument in Kazakhstan in 1995 when they were arguing about the constitution. We're not going to adopt an official language. So the official, this designation in Kyrgyzstan was, and I believe right now is again, or still the official language, not the state, not the second state language. And why? Well, I can refer perhaps back to some of the same factors I talked about earlier. Kyrgyzstan is very closely aligned with Russia. And after Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan had the largest share of ethnic Russian population, and certainly in the north of Kyrgyzstan, in the Chu Valley and in Bishkek in particular, Russian was the dominant language even among Kyrgyz. So Russian was and remains very important in Kyrgyzstan. There is somewhat historically, I think, a more positive attitude. I hope I don't step on any toes, and I don't want to get into polemic here, but perhaps a more positive attitude toward Russia more generally in Kyrgyzstan and in Kazakhstan. Perhaps it helps that Kyrgyzstan does not have a border, let alone border territories that are argued about with Russia. And at the time of independence, or at least in 1989 at the census, Russians in Kyrgyzstan were 21.5% of the population. Today, Russians, I think, are around 5.5%, though it's radically decreased. And unlike Kazakhstan, which has had a lot of money to invest in teaching Kazakh language, printing books, developing Kazakh corpus of the language, new terminology, publishing textbooks in Kazakh. Kyrgyzstan is very dependent on Russian language. It just doesn't have the money, and Russian remains a very important language. Now, what is going to happen in Kyrgyzstan now under Japarov, assuming he remains the president? There is sort of a more Kyrgyz-focused national construction project, if you will. But I think it's quite understandable that in Kyrgyzstan, Russian has a special status. By the way, in Tajikistan, I believe it still might be listed as the language of inter-ethnic communication, but its role there is very different than in Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. I guess that actually probably I'm not positive, but I guess that the status of Russian language in Kyrgyzstan was a bit higher than like official, because that Kyrgyzstan much more dependent in security issues. Probably, that my guess.
Right. I would agree with you if we talk about the real status. Yes. But if we talk about strictly what do the documents say, it has been called the official language, официальный. I don't know what the Kyrgyz word is for official, but and I think it is. It's also evident, for example, in higher education. whereas according to the official data in Kazakhstan, 65% of the pupils in higher education today are in Kazakh groups. In Kyrgyzstan, 65% are still in Russian groups. So yes, in fact, the status of Russian is much higher. I'm just referring to the documents which have listed it at times, not consistently, as the official language, not the second state language.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Okay, we will
the question.
move to other questions because we have lots of them. And now I will ask Gülşen Şekeraydın to read her question because it's quite a general question, and I will add one more from the chat because they are connected.
Okay.
And Gülşen,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Do you able to hear me? Okay. Professor Fierman, thank you very much for your good presentation. It is a great pleasure to listen it. You mentioned about the factors shaping the language policies of Central Asian states. Among them, which one do you consider to be the most influential, or maybe is there such a simple formula or not?
That's an interesting question. Most influential. I guess in some ways, I'd say Turkmenistan, because of the level of authoritarianism and the way the country has been blocked off from the rest of the world. I mean, in Turkmenistan, despite the quite great demand for education in Russian, the number of opportunities, number of places for Turkmen, especially Turkmen, but Turkmenistan children to study in Russian are very limited. Turkmenistan has very tight control over the official press. Who reads it, I don't know, but the textbooks are, under government control to a much, under central government control, tight government control to a greater extent. So in terms of influential, I think I might say Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan, actually here, maybe this is the best example of all. During the 1990s, Turkmenistan, still under the Turkmenbaşı, was planning to shift to the Latin alphabet. And it was going rather slowly until I think like December 27th, 1999, when something was issued in Turkmenistan, which said that starting in the new century, that is after 2000, all Turkmenistan will shift to the Latin alphabet. It's over. Turkmenistan shifted to the Latin alphabet, and 4 days later, all the newspapers were coming out in the Latin alphabet, probably with lots of mistakes, but they were only in the Latin alphabet. That's pretty influential, I would think. I don't know if that's what you had in mind by influential, but that's what comes to my mind.
And we have also other kind of general question, and not on all the Central Asian countries, but
sure, I'll do my best.
Just focus on the Kazakhstan again. Kazakh, I don't know the real name, but the nickname is Kazakh, is asking, why do you think Russian prevailed in Kazakhstan more than other Central Asian countries? Is it due to the economical reasons or any other reasons? Why do we improve the status of Kazakh? How can we improve the status of Kazakh language? Should it be managed by the authority?
Wow, how many hours do I have for that one?
Try to answer in a very short way, because we have at least
I will do my best to be
questions.
succinct. The reason, I think a lot of the reason is historical. If the question has to do with why it was so dominant in the Soviet era, I would say, well, look at the demography, among other things. The Kazakhstan cities were overwhelmingly Russian language, and in fact, the Kazakhs were a very small share of the population. And once you start off with that policy, it's very, and the continuing, it's not as if everyone who spoke Russian disappeared after independence and everybody overnight learned Kazakh. It takes a long time to shift to another language. And a lot of people were afraid of that. And they voted with their feet and went to Russia or elsewhere because they were afraid of having to shift to a new language. My own recipe. I've spoken about this in Kazakhstan a number of times. I think we're 30 years after independence, and lots should have been done much earlier. But I think that the key thing, the key should be that young people should want to learn Kazakh and be exposed to Kazakh from the very early years on. I think the fact that Kazakhstan did not have attractive, interesting, engaging Kazakh language media for children, television in particular, was a huge mistake. It was a strategic question of strategic importance. People will want to learn Kazakh when the quality of material, the quality of opportunities in Kazakh is attractive. And until then, nobody wants to learn a language which is not used, and for which, for example, if all the translations in Russian are more authoritative, are better, why do you need to know the Kazakh? So I think, number one, emphasize on young people, make the language interesting, produce products that are attractive, and the problem, it takes time. It will take time. I mean, I know many children, I've talked to many children in Kazakhstan, even Kazakhs, who say, I don't want to learn that language. What do I need it for?
Okay, and probably I have a very small question connecting that what you said last. And like, is there any law that actually helps to protect Kazakh speaking in Kazakhstan? I mean, the titular language, because I just can compare with Ukraine, and in Ukraine just this week, finally, after 30 years, the new law was introduced. So if you want to be like in public sphere, if you want hear Ukrainian, so like finally it came. So if you come to the shop, let's say, so first the people should appear to you in Ukrainian, let's say. And by this way, state try to not to do something to the other languages, minority languages, or even Russian, which is not minority, of course, but it tries to protect Ukrainian speaking. So is there any law which protects Kazakh speaking in Kazakhstan?
Wow, what a great question. I should have told you to ask that if you didn't. Thank you. Indeed, there is not. Although, again, the Constitution says that there is one государственный, resmi, there is only one. And the language law says the same thing. There is one gosязык, it is Kazakh. But it's ambiguous because it says that Russian наряду с госязыком русский, то есть русский употребляется официально вот в таких-то случаях. So Russian is used officially in certain things. So that offers this huge loophole, and many Kazakhs, especially among the literary intelligentsia, have been arguing for years, saying that, one, this reference to the Russian language in the Constitution and the language law must be eliminated. And if that were eliminated, then the Constitution would just say Kazakh is the state language and Russian is another of the minority languages. And many have also been arguing for years for a specific law on the state language. And indeed, there has been a petition to remove the reference to the Russian in the Constitution. It's been signed by 130,000 people online already, at least. So this is the argument of many Kazakhs. Well, what about our language? All these other languages are protected. Why not we, the Kazakhs? This is after our historic territory. Why is there no protection for Kazakh? But then there are also some Kazakhs who Ruskoязычные Kazakh, Russian dominant Kazakhs who say, wait a minute, this is Kazakhstan, and we're Kazakhs as much as anyone else, but our dominant language right now is Russian. So we want protections.
Thank you very much. And now we will again come to more wide question about the general Central Asia and connection between Central Asia countries.
May I comment on my question just 1 minute?
Okay, yeah.
Hi, my name is Gauhar.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Can't you hear me?
Faintly. Please speak as loud as you can.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for your reply. So actually, I would quite comment on your point. Actually, there are a lot of fairy tales which was translated from Russian into Kazakh, such as, for example, when you can watch from Balapan TV. Also, like Harry Potter was translated into Kazakh. So
yes.
I would, yeah. Also, but I think that the first thing that government authorities should control the promotion of Kazakh, like not being afraid of Kremlin or Putin or whatever, like because we know from the history that Tsarist Bolshevik forces forced to learn Russian for everybody, even in Kazakhstan. So why can't we just also force them to learn Kazakh?
Thank you. You know, I hear you. I understand your question, but for example, I think that for the peace in the country, it needs to be a gradual process. Now you could say, well, it's been 30 years already. How gradual do you want it? I don't think that the movement in the first 15 to 20 years was very very great. And I hear from people who are concerned about what a more forceful Kazakhization would entail. Let's say something like medical education. You want doctors to be able to speak Kazakh. Well, do you want a doctor if your child is sick, above all, who speaks Kazakh, or one who is competent? Because the terminology, the medical terminology in Kazakh, and the amount of literature that is in Kazakh medical literature is not as broad. I believe that in the future, Kazakhs, I vote with 3 hands for Kazakh to be the state and only state language for Kazakhstan. Now, maybe I shouldn't have even said that. That's my own personal opinion. However, I believe that in the future, Kazakhstanis and includes Kazakhs in Kazakhstan will need to know another language for many purposes. Now, maybe not all Kazakhstanis will know. I mean, hey, in the United States, most people know one language if they know one language very well. But you know, look at a West European country. Look at Norway. Look at Greece. These languages function in many domains, but for higher education and for specialized education, not everything gets translated into this state language. And I think it is to everyone's advantage that everyone learns, not everyone, that people who are with higher education and people who have certain needs for their professional lives or their everyday living situation life know a second and perhaps a third language, whether that's Russian or perhaps somewhere down the line English. I don't know, but there is a cost to shifting everything, especially to try to shift it rapidly into Kazakh. Kazakhs and others living in Kazakhstan will need to know a second language. I believe that everyone, and former President Nazarbayev and President Tokayev have said that everyone it is the duty, it is the responsibility of every citizen of Kazakhstan to know the Kazakh language. And if I were there, if I were a member of the Majlis, I would support a law or a regulation, if I worked in the Ministry of Education, that a secondary education would require a diploma, would require demonstration of proficiency in Kazakh. At the same time, I think that there is and there will be in the future a need for other language, and that there is a very severe cost to too rapid a shift. And I again say, yeah, 30 years is a long time, but I think a lot of time was lost.
Okay, thank you very much. We do not much time left, so I will ask Stefan Bahri, I guess, if I pronounce correct, to read the question. And it will be about the general of the region.
Дякую. Это украинское прізвище, Bahri.
Okay.
Канадский. I wanted to ask about the comparative aspect to the other countries in Central Asia and the neighboring countries, other than Russia, because we're always talking about Russia. And I'm interested in whether there's any prospects for some return to some collaboration, cross-border collaboration in multilingualism, as we used to have for Uzbeks, for example, in Kazakhstan, could get support from Uzbekistan and so on. And that also connects to the Kazakhs of Mongolia, the Oralman coming from there and from Xinjiang are bringing Chinese language in, and any chance for supporting Central Asian languages in Northwest China and so on. Just what's your take on this kind of thing?
Yeah. I would say that the general trend throughout the region has been the national projects and including the language manifestations of those projects have been to emphasize the titular nationality and its language, and creating a nation that emphasizes that ethnic group and that language. There is some of that cross-border within the region cooperation. Very little. Number one, most of the countries can't afford to support their own educational system very well. Kazakhstan is, again, the wealthiest, and Kazakhstan is making some support for Kazakhs living abroad available. Among other things, there is a quota for Kazakhs from the diaspora to come to Kazakhstan for higher education. But you have such things, for example, as the bad relations between countries. Until recently, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan had horrible relations. There has been a very strong policy in Tajikistan of Tajikization. The Uzbek schools, the share of Uzbek schools has radically decreased. That's a whole other lecture. So that you know, now the Kazakhs, the Tajikistan and Uzbekistan have much improved relations, and they have even promised to build schools in each other's capitals for that is, build schools where tuition will be in those languages. There still are about 6% of Tajikistan's pupils studying in Uzbek, according to official data. It had been much higher, somewhere in the 20s. So yeah, some of that is happening. But you know, when you're dealing with a country like Tajikistan, it certainly doesn't have the resources to develop. Turkmenistan, well, forget it. I mean, it's like on Mars. There just are not many relations, cultural initiatives. Let's see, who did I leave out? The Kyrgyz. I mean, Kyrgyz is a poor country, does not have the resources. These things take money. Uzbekistan, sort of maybe in the middle, but Uzbekistan has not been doing much of that kind of thing. Kazakhstan, I would say, has been the leader, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it is relatively wealthy. And you know, in terms of China, well, you know probably as well as I do the situation of the minority languages in Xinjiang. So limited. One other thing I'd add, in general, one of the things that I have been very surprised by, there is remarkably little done to, even among scholars, to study the languages of the other Turkic groups in Central Asia. There's study of Turkish is quite common, but you know, study of Uzbek in not including the very few Uzbek schools in Kazakhstan. Study of Uzbek is quite exotic in Kazakhstan, even among specialists.
Okay,
Well, thank you for your answer. That was great.
Sorry, I have a related question, if possible, Yulia.
Please.
And
Yeah,
Professor
sure.
Fierman.
Tingdap Turman.
Okay, it's about the oral mandar and their possible oral mandar is basically the Kazakh diaspora
That have returned.
that have returned to homeland. So I have various different update on the issue in terms of their possible contribution to the language processes and you know, how they influence the overall language atmosphere in Kazakhstan. I mean, have they managed to contribute to Kazakhification in terms of language, or have they indeed reversely Russified in the process? Is kind of my curious question.
Yeah. I don't think they've Russified most of them. Many have found, to their astonishment, that coming to their homeland, Otan, that they have had to learn Russian because it's hard to get by without Russian in many parts of Kazakhstan. So yeah, they've had to acquire Russian, but I think by and large they have contributed to the growing Kazakh share of the or Kazakh speaking share of the population. As you know, however, the Oromans have a mixed reputation in Kazakhstan. Many of the people, Kazakhstani citizens, including Kazakhs, say, "Wait a minute. Yes, they know better, purer Kazakh than most of us Russified Kazakhs do in Kazakhstan, but we don't have enough to support the population of Kazakhstan well to a high enough level. Why are we paying money to bring people here from outside of Kazakhstan who are not necessarily very well educated, and they come with an attitude of entitlement, that they are entitled to certain privileges when they come here. I've been living here all my life, and I'm a Kazakh. Why don't I have some privileges? So there is, as you know, resentment also towards them. But overall, yes, there are about 1 million Oroman have come. It's very small, the share coming right now, but yeah, that is one of the things. And of course, the high birth rate in the Kazakh village, in the villages of Kazakhstan, has contributed, and the Russian exodus sort of changes the balance of people who know the languages. By the way, I have one other really surprising statistic that I'll just throw out there. Of the higher education students in Kazakhstan today, that is, higher education students in Kazakhstan today, only 6% are ethnic Russians. Many ethnic Russians are either not going on to higher education, or they're going to Russia for higher education, and many of them stay there. There are also Kazakhs who go to Russia, of course.
Interesting. Thanks.
We have a few questions, connected questions about the Latinization. So probably we have to pass to these questions. First one is from Turgut Kerem-Tuncel. And Turgut Bey, can you read your question? Because another question about Latinization is very similar.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Blecka, and thank you very much, Professor William Fierman. Actually, if I understood you correctly, you identified Latinization of the Kazakh alphabet as a symbolic act. However, what comes to my mind as a question is whether there may be rather political reasons for the Latinization of the Kazakh alphabet, particularly related to Kazakhstan's relations with Russia and the Western world. I would like to ask you if we can interpret Latinization in Kazakhstan as a sign of a civilizational choice.
Of what kind of choice? I'm sorry, what kind of choice?
Civilizational, or similarly pick up with Soviet heritage. These are my questions that I would like to ask you, sir.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I say the word symbolic because the symbolic value is huge. And the reaction from Russia certainly indicates that. I believe that the decision is basically a political one, which maybe covers a lot of what you refer to as civilizational. I'm not a linguist. I personally think that the decision is, above all, a political decision, a political act. I don't think that the linguistic advantages of having Latin or Cyrillic are clear. I say that as a non-linguist. But yes, of course, it has tremendous implications. Some of them symbolic, and that's what sort of jumps out at me, the symbolism. But there are practical implications of it, and the implications for the kinds of ties with Russia, as opposed to, let's say, with Turkey and the other countries of the Turkic world, are extremely important. I put it, that's why I sort of put it in between the symbolic, at the end of the symbolic, when I went into the more substantial changes. But I think it's very important. I just don't think that the real reason has to do with linguistics or pedagogy. I think, after all, the Chinese manage without a Latin or a Cyrillic alphabet, and it takes a little longer to learn to read it. But thank you that there are lots of literate people and many very educated people in China as well.
Okay, and
Yes, sir.
we don't have much time, I guess like 5, 6, 7 minutes. So we have 2 questions about the Russian, like the removing of all from the surnames, Russian suffixes, and about the historical renaming or in the Kazakhstan. So because of the lack of time, I will just briefly read both questions because by somehow they connected, and then I will let you to answer this. So
Okay.
how do you, this is a question from El-Tirishan El-Chibey, how do you interpret the removal of Russian suffixes like of and ova from the last names of people? Is such a movement was able to find a supporter among Kazakh people? The first one, and the second one about the historical places and names. Nurbolat Nishanbayev. I'm sorry if I read it in the wrong way. So first of all, thanks for excellent presentation. I would love to hear your point on the ethnonym policy in Kazakhstan. This year, Kazakhstan is celebrating 30 years anniversary for independence. What were the main factor not to return historical name to Pavlodar, Petropavl Oblast in the 30 years? Is there any chance to make it happen in 2021 from your point of view? So one is about Russian surname, another is about Russian names.
All right, I will try to be telegraphic. In terms of Russian surnames, some people have changed, have dropped the ova. It's, you know, it's as you wish. In Kazakhstan, there are various options and various proposals for what to replace that with, if anything, like ulu, kızı for female, ulu for male. I might mention in you know, in some places, less in Kazakhstan than elsewhere, among the Kyrgyz and Kazakhs and Uzbeks, dropping the O for ova, they have found this to be problematic when if they go to Russia and they try to get work, that they're discriminated against because of because they don't have the suffix, so they want the suffix back. Some people even shifted. I think that that many people in Kazakhstan have changed. I don't think it's the majority, but I mean, it's a lot of trouble. You've got to change all your documents and so forth. But yeah, it's happening. I don't have any estimate of the extent. And for the cities, there's been a lot of articles about the need to change the names of Pavlodar and Petropavlovsk of late. In fact, just today I read on the site Abay KZ, an article in Kazakh, which notes that Kunayev, who was the first secretary of the Communist Party, used to refer to one of these cities by its old new name. Yeah, I think it's possible. It could happen. Again, this is not something that's going to be decided by a vote of the population. It's going to be decided by someone at the very top, and I don't even think that it is President Tokayev. It is the Yelbasa who will make that decision. It is possible.
Thank you so much.
I'm very sorry. I guess we are kind of because it's already 9 o'clock here,
Yeah,
and we have to finish. So there are some questions left, but
people can write to me at my email, W Fierman.
I will just send your email to the chat, to the general chat, so everyone will see it. And I checked the question. There are some left, but by somehow I can see that you answered at least partly them. Most of the question left again about the Russian in Kazakhstan. So how to make Russians to learn Kazakhs and etc. So unfortunately, we don't have much time. So we have to finish this section. And thank you very much, Professor Fierman, for
Thank you for staying up so late, and
I'm not-
especially
but
those of you in
it's
Kazakhstan.
Great, the presentation is great, and we have so many questions, so many participants. I'm so happy that this event had, was so popular around the world, actually, as I can see from the participants. And before we also finished, actually, I also can say that the website and podcast by Turgut Kerem Tuncel, he asked actually today questions. Dünyanın Ortası, he deals with a lot of issues, including language policy. So if you have any questions and you want to discuss this question, you can discuss under this presentation on the Dünyanın Ortası, and probably me and other organizers try to make some contributions to the discussion. So if you have any question left, you can also write under that stream, and we can discuss directly online. So maybe it will be a productive, I guess it will be a productive discussion. So I will leave the word for the Professor Fierman and Işık Hoca to finish it, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks.
Okay, so
Professor,
do you want to say something?
well,
Me?
I can, yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
mean, I can just say, sorry, I can just say, it's actually, I forget about the curfew totally, and I left my 2 kids at my parents' home. So I have to make up something for the police. Any recommendations are welcome. If they stop.
Write it in Kazakh.
Okay, yeah, perhaps. But other than that, it was great. I mean, I wasn't really expecting that your talk would bring all these people together, and we had a great brainstorming with your enlightening speech, and we reconsidered, revisit a lot of issues. And I think a lot of our Kazakh friends here, especially people from Kazakhstan, friends from Kazakhstan, would be also happy that we had such a great opportunity. And hopefully in the future we have more talks on Kazakhstan. And actually Aziz is here, Aziz Burhanov. He'll be contributing. He'll be talking about nation building in Kazakhstan. So the program is coming out soon. So stay in touch. We'll probably publish it, right, Yulia, at Dünyanın Ortası, Turgut Hoca's Facebook page and relevant media. So stay connected. Thanks, Professor Fierman. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you later, I guess.
Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry that the time is not very convenient for some of you, but this gave me an opportunity to draw some thoughts together.
Oh, wonderful.
Very great. Okay.
Okay.
So I guess we can finish, and I just will share the again the link to the recording of this video. So if by somehow you missed the part, you can check the recording from that link. And see you next session, because we have, as Işık Hoca already told, we have a lot of them. So it was nice to hear all of you, and Professor Fierman, you're just great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I'm finishing the session.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
we'll leave. Bye, good night, and good morning, I guess, for those in the US. Bye.
Rahmet.